April 11th, 1943, 22,000 feet above the Coral Sea. First Lieutenant Robert de Haven watches through his gun sight as a Mitsubishi Zero rolls into view, 800 yards out and closing in a lazy turn against the brilliant Pacific sky. The Japanese fighter gleams silver-white in the tropical sun, its red Hinomaris visible even at this distance. De Haven's hands rest steady on the control yoke of his P-38 Lightning. Every instinct, every hour of training, tells him to wait. Get closer. Standard fighter doctrine demanded closing to 300 yards or less before opening fire. At 800 yards, wing-mounted guns spread their fire so wide that hitting anything became pure luck. But de Haven doesn't have wing-mounted guns. His right thumb settles on the firing button. He doesn't aim at the Zero. He aims at empty sky, a full wingspan below where the Japanese fighter is flying. The Lightning shudders as 4 50-caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon erupt from its nose, sending a concentrated stream of fire into apparently vacant air. The Zero flies directly into that stream. Metal tears. The fighter's left wing crumples. Smoke trails behind as it rolls inverted and begins the long spiral toward the ocean below. De Haven has just made a kill at a range that should have been impossible. And he's done it using a principle that most American pilots didn't yet understand. When you had your guns mounted in the nose of your aircraft, you didn't aim where your target was. You aimed below the horizon, letting gravity's predictable pull bring your bullets to exactly where physics demanded they would be. By April 1943, the P-38 Lightning had been flying combat missions in the Pacific for less than 6 months. The twin-boomed, twin-engine fighter looked like nothing else in the sky. Its distinctive silhouette, 2 engines mounted in long booms connected by a short central nacelle containing the cockpit and all armament made it instantly recognizable to friend and enemy alike. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Lightning had arrived in theater with a reputation. It could fly 400 miles per hour in level flight. It could climb to 25,000 feet in under 7 minutes. Its range exceeded 1,200 miles on internal fuel, allowing missions deep into enemy territory that other American fighters simply couldn't reach. Twin Allison V-17-10 engines meant that a pilot could limp home on one power plant if the other took damage, a critical advantage when flying over hundreds of miles of open ocean. But it was the Lightning's armament configuration that made it truly unique among American fighters. Every gun was mounted in the nose of the central nacelle, 4 Browning 50-caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm autocannon, all firing straight ahead along the aircraft's centerline. This was radically different from every other American fighter in service. The P-40 Warhawk mounted its 6 50-caliber guns in the wings, 3 per side. The P-39 Airacobra had wing guns and a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. Even the newer P-47 Thunderbolt, just beginning to appear in combat, carried 8 50-caliber guns distributed across its broad wings. Wing-mounted guns required harmonization, or convergence, the process of angling each weapon slightly inward so their bullet streams crossed at a specific distance, typically between 200 and 400 yards. Inside that convergence zone, the concentration of fire could be devastating, but outside that range, effectiveness dropped catastrophically. At 600 yards, wing-mounted guns on a P-51 Mustang spread their fire across an area 15 feet wide. At 800 yards, that spread exceeded 20 feet. The P-38's nose-mounted guns fired parallel to each other. They never converged and never diverged. At 300 yards, the bullet pattern measured roughly 3 feet across. At 600 yards, it measured 3 feet across. At 1,000 yards, still 3 feet across. The concentration of fire remained constant regardless of range. This gave skilled P-38 pilots a tremendous advantage. They could reliably hit targets at distances where other fighters were wasting ammunition. But exploiting that advantage required understanding something most pilots had never been taught. Lieutenant Richard Bong discovered it during his first weeks of combat operations with the 49th Fighter Group in late 1942. Bong had graduated from flight training in January of that year and arrived in Australia in September after a brief stint as a gunnery instructor stateside. His initial transition to the P-38 had been rushed. Most pilots received only a few hours in the Lightning before being declared combat ready. On November 17, 1942, Bong flew his first combat mission, an escort for B-17 bombers attacking Japanese positions near Buna on New Guinea's northern coast. The formation encountered Zeros at 18,000 feet. Bong rolled into an attack on a Japanese fighter below him, diving from altitude and building speed. At 600 yards, he opened fire, centering his reflector sight's aiming reticle directly on the Zero's cockpit. He expected to see strikes. Instead, his tracer rounds arced beneath the enemy fighter's belly by what looked like 20 or 30 feet. The Zero broke hard left, apparently unaware it had even been shot at, and disappeared into a cloud layer. Bong pulled up, confused and frustrated. He knew his guns were bore-sighted properly. They'd been checked before the mission. The armament crews had aligned all 5 weapons to converge at a point 350 yards ahead of the aircraft, with a slight upward angle to compensate for bullet drop at that specific range. What Bong didn't yet understand was that bullet drop wasn't constant. It varied with range. And at 600 yards, double his gun's harmonization distance, gravity had pulled his bullets significantly farther below his line of sight than the gun sight's aiming point accounted for. That evening, Bong sought out Captain Edward Cragg, one of the more experienced pilots in the squadron. Cragg had been flying P-40 seconds earlier in the war and had transitioned to P-38 seconds in October. He listened to Bong's description of the engagement and nodded knowingly. "You're shooting long range in a Lightning," Cragg said. "That changes everything." He explained the physics. When a bullet left the gun's muzzle, it immediately began falling due to gravity. At the P-38's standard cruising speed of 220 miles per hour, the aircraft itself was moving forward at about 320 feet per second. The 50 caliber bullets left the muzzle at roughly 2,900 feet per second fast, but not instantaneous. At 350 yards, the range where the P-38's guns were harmonized, the bullets took approximately 1/3 of a second to reach the target. During that third of a second, gravity pulled each bullet downward approximately 1.7 feet. The slight upward angle built into the gun mount compensated for this drop, making the bullets arrive at the same point where the pilot aimed. But at 600 yards, the bullets needed almost 6/10 of a second to reach the target. Gravity had more than half a second to act on them. They dropped not 1.7 feet, but over 5.5 feet. The gun's upward angle, calibrated for 350 yards, couldn't compensate for that much drop. The result? Bullets passing harmlessly beneath the target. "So, what do I do?" Bong asked. "Aim low," Cragg said simply. "If you're shooting past 500 yards, put your pipper below, the target, way below. Let gravity bring the rounds up to where they need to be." Bong absorbed this information with the intensity of a man whose life might depend on it, because it did. The next day, during another escort mission, he got another chance. A Zero attacked the bomber formation from above, rolling into a high-side pass. Bong intercepted, approaching from the Zero's 7 o'clock position at range of 700 yards. Instead of aiming at the Zero's fuselage, he placed his aiming reticle at the level of the Zero's bottom wing surface. He squeezed the trigger. The P-38's nose lit up with muzzle flashes. Through his bulletproof windscreen, Bong watched his tracers arc upward and converge directly on the Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter shuddered, pieces separated from its tail. Black smoke trailed behind as it rolled away and dove toward the jungle below, Bong's first confirmed kill. Over the following weeks, he refined his technique through trial, error, and careful observation. He learned that the amount he needed to aim below the target depended on range and, to a lesser extent, on the target's aspect angle. Head-on shots required less compensation because relative closure speed was high and time of flight was short. Tail chases at long range required the most compensation because the target was moving away, effectively increasing the time bullets needed to reach it. By January 1943, Bong had 5 confirmed kills, enough to qualify as an ace. His success hadn't gone unnoticed. Other pilots in the 49th Fighter Group began seeking his advice. How was he consistently hitting targets at ranges where they were still missing? Bong shared what he'd learned. He explained bullet drop. He demonstrated the aiming technique using his hands to illustrate the vertical offset required at different ranges. He emphasized that the P-38's nose-mounted guns made this technique possible in ways that wing-mounted guns never could. With wing guns, he told a group of newer pilots gathered around his aircraft after a mission, "You've got to get close because your bullets are spreading out sideways. Doesn't matter if you aim high or low. If you're outside convergence range, you're just not going to hit anything." He slapped the side of his Lightning's nose. "But with these guns, all firing straight ahead, distance doesn't spread your pattern. Bullet drop is the only thing you're fighting, and bullet drop is predictable. It follows the same curve every time. Once you learn to compensate for it, you can hit targets way out there." He pointed toward the horizon. 800 yards, 900. "I've made kills at 1,000. One of the pilots, a young lieutenant fresh from the States, looked skeptical. 1,000 yards? That's over half a mile. How do you even see the target clearly enough to aim?" Bong smiled. "You don't aim at what you see. You aim below what you see. Trust the physics." This concept, shooting below the visual horizon of the target, seemed counterintuitive to pilots whose entire training had emphasized putting the aiming reticle directly on the enemy. It violated every instinct. The human brain naturally wanted to point the gun at the threat. Aiming at empty space, at nothing, felt fundamentally wrong. But physics didn't care about instinct. The Japanese pilots flying Zeros certainly didn't understand what was happening. From their perspective, American P-38 seconds had suddenly developed the ability to hit them from distances that should have been safely out of range. The Zero's own armament, 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and 2 20mm cannons in the wings, was harmonized for much closer engagements, typically between 200 and 300 yards, where the Zero's superior maneuverability gave Japanese pilots the advantage. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized close-range dogfighting. The Zero could outturn any American fighter at speeds below 200 miles per hour. In a slow, turning fight, the Zero won almost every time. Japanese pilots had been trained to force these kinds of engagements, to slow the fight down, to make it a contest of maneuverability rather than speed or altitude. But the P-38 pilots who learned the long-range shooting technique stopped playing that game. Captain Thomas Maguire, who arrived in the Pacific in March 1943 and joined the 4075th Fighter Group, became another early adopter of the extended-range shooting technique. Maguire had a background in mathematics and immediately grasped the ballistic principles Bong described. He calculated bullet trajectories on paper, working out the exact drop at various ranges, and practiced visualization exercises to train his brain to accept the counterintuitive aiming solution. During a mission on August 18, 1943, Maguire's 4-plane flight intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros near WWII. The bombers were flying at 15,000 feet. The Zeros were stepped up above them at 17,000 feet. Maguire dove on the fighter formation from 19,000 feet, building speed to over 400 miles per hour. At 900 yards, nearly twice the effective range of the Zero's wing-mounted cannons, he opened fire on the lead Zero. He aimed his Pipper at the level of the Zero's wing root, well below the actual aircraft. The 50 caliber rounds and 20mm cannon shells traced an upward arc and converged on the Zero's engine. The cowling disintegrated. The Zero rolled inverted and fell away in flames. Maguire had made the kill before the Japanese pilot could even react to the attack. By the time the Zero's wingmen realized they were under attack, Maguire had already climbed back above them, using the P-38's superior speed and power. This was the essence of the boom and zoom tactic that became standard for P-38 operations in the Pacific. Approach from high altitude, dive at high speed, fire from long range using the nose-mounted gun's superior accuracy, then use speed to climb back to altitude before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could engage in a turning fight. The long-range shooting capability made the entire tactic viable. Without it, P-38 pilots would have needed to close to 300 or 400 yards, close enough that Zeros could return effective fire, close enough that a P-38 might bleed too much energy in the diving attack to escape back to altitude. But shooting at 800 or 900 yards meant the P-38 pilot could often destroy or damage enemy fighters before they could effectively respond. And even if the first pass didn't score a kill, it disrupted the enemy formation and put the P-38's position to climb away safely. Major George Preddy, commanding officer of a P-38 squadron in the 5th Air Force, documented the technique in a tactical bulletin distributed to newly arriving pilots in June 1943. His memo was blunt and practical. The Lightning's nose guns are its primary advantage over enemy fighters. Learn to use them at extended range. At 600 yards or greater, aim below your target's visible position. How far below depends on range. At 600 yards, aim at target's bottom surface. At 800 yards, aim 1 to 2 wingspan lengths below visible target. At 1,000 yards, aim 2 to 3 wingspan lengths below. The memo continued. Enemy fighters with wing-mounted guns cannot effectively return fire at these ranges. Their bullet patterns are too dispersed. Use this advantage. Do not close to within their effective range unless you have no choice. Preddy's guidance was based on hard-won experience. He himself had made numerous long-range kills using the technique. His squadron's kill-to-loss ratio improved dramatically after pilots adopted the aiming method. But the technique wasn't easy to learn. It required pilots to overcome powerful psychological barriers. Lieutenant Robert Westbrook, flying with the 18th Fighter Group, described the challenge in a letter home in July 1943. The hardest thing about fighting out here isn't the enemy, it's getting your own brain to cooperate. You see a Zero at 800 yards. Every nerve in your body wants to put the sight right on him. But if you do that, you'll miss. You have to aim at nothing, at empty sky below him, and trust that your bullets will curve up and hit. It feels insane every single time. But it works. The Japanese eventually began to recognize the pattern. Combat reports from captured documents and post-war interviews with Japanese pilots revealed growing awareness that American P-38 seconds were somehow hitting targets from impossible distances. Japanese tactical bulletins from late 1943 warned pilots about the Lightning's extended effective range and recommended avoiding head-on or overtaking attacks where the P-38's superior speed and long-range armament gave American pilots maximum advantage. Some Japanese pilots suspected the Americans had developed new, more powerful guns or improved ammunition. They didn't understand that the secret wasn't the weapons themselves, but rather how American pilots had learned to employ them. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with over 60 confirmed kills, later wrote about encountering P-38 seconds in late 1943. In his memoir, he noted, "The strange Lightnings made their combat debut in the Solomon Islands during the fall of 1942. Soon they were appearing in ever-increasing numbers, often challenging our Zero fighters. Before long, however, the painful lesson of burning P-38 seconds changed the situation. What changed wasn't the P-38 itself, it was how American pilots learned to fight in it. And central to that evolution was mastering the counterintuitive art of aiming below the target. By the end of 1943, the long-range shooting technique had spread throughout P-38 squadrons in the Pacific. Gunnery officers incorporated it into training materials. Experienced pilots demonstrated it to newcomers. Gun camera footage showing successful long-range kills was analyzed and shared. The technique wasn't universal, and it wasn't magic. Many pilots never fully mastered it. Some preferred to close to traditional ranges where muscle memory and instinct could guide their aim. The technique worked best for pilots with good depth perception, strong mathematical intuition, and the psychological flexibility to trust counterintuitive solutions. But for those who did master it, pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, Robert de Haven, and dozens of others. The technique transformed the P-38 from a capable fighter into a devastating long-range predator. Richard Bong's success became legendary. By May 1944, he had achieved 27 confirmed kills, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, promoted him to major and sent him back to the United States for gunnery school, not as a student, but as someone who could share his combat experience with instructors and help refine training methods. Bong returned to the Pacific in October 1944 and continued flying combat missions. By December, his score stood at 40 confirmed kills, making him America's highest-scoring ace of the war. Every one of those kills had been achieved in a P-38 Lightning. Many had been made at ranges exceeding 600 yards. Thomas Maguire, flying with the 475th Fighter Group, pursued Bong's record with intense competitiveness. Maguire had studied Bong's techniques obsessively, refining his own approach to long-range gunnery. He developed a reputation for making kills at extreme distances, sometimes over 900 yards. On December 26, 1944, Maguire scored 3 kills in a single mission, bringing his total to 38, just 2 behind Bong. His squadron mates reported watching him engage a Zero from what appeared to be well over 1,000 yards, placing his aiming reticle so far below the target that it seemed impossible the bullets could ever connect. But they did. The Zero exploded in mid-air. Tragically, Maguire was killed on January 7, 1945, when his P-38 stalled and spun into the ground while attempting to help a fellow pilot who was under attack. He died 2 kills short of Bong's record. Both men received the Medal of Honor for their accomplishments. The story of the P-38's long-range gunnery capability wasn't just about individual aces. It represented a broader evolution in how American fighter pilots understood and employed their weapons. Prior to the Pacific War, American fighter doctrine had been heavily influenced by European combat experience, particularly observations from the Battle of Britain and reports from American volunteers flying with the Royal Air Force. British fighter tactics emphasized close-range shooting with wing-mounted guns, typically inside 400 yards. The RAF had experimented with different harmonization patterns. Some squadrons converged their guns to a point at 250 yards, others spread them in a rectangular pattern at 400 yards. American training programs adopted similar approaches. Student pilots at fighter training schools in the southwestern United States practiced shooting at towed sleeve targets from 200 to 300 yards. Instructors emphasized getting close before firing. Ammunition was too valuable to waste on long-range shots that statistically achieved nothing. This doctrine made perfect sense for fighters with wing-mounted guns. It made no sense for the P-38. The Lightning's nose-mounted armament configuration was an accident of design, not a deliberate tactical choice. When Lockheed's design team, led by Hall Hibbard and Clarence Kelly Johnson, developed the aircraft in response to a 1937 Army Air Corps specification, the twin-boom configuration was chosen primarily to solve a propeller clearance problem with the twin engines and tricycle landing gear. Mounting all the guns in the nose was simply the most practical solution given the aircraft's unusual layout. The designers knew it would eliminate convergence issues. They probably didn't fully appreciate how much tactical advantage it would provide. That advantage emerged only through combat experience. And it emerged despite, not because of, official doctrine. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical principles underlying long-range shooting with nose-mounted guns were well understood by ordnance engineers and ballisticians. The mathematics of projectile motion had been worked out centuries earlier, but translating that academic understanding into practical combat technique required pilots willing to experiment, to question established doctrine, and to share what they learned. Captain Edward Cragg, the pilot who first explained bullet drop to Richard Bong, had figured it out through observation and deduction. Cragg had noticed that his tracers seemed to arc differently at different ranges. Instead of dismissing this as an optical illusion, he'd sought out the squadron armourer and asked detailed questions about gun harmonization, muzzle velocity, and ballistic coefficients. The armourer, a technical sergeant named James Wheeler, had explained the physics. Wheeler had worked as a competition rifle shooter before the war and understood external ballistics intimately. He explained how gravity affected projectile paths, how air resistance modified trajectories, and how the slight upward angle built into the P-38's gun bounce was calculated to compensate for drop at a specific range. "But that's just one range," Wheeler told Cragg. 350 yards, that's where your guns meet your sight line. Closer than that, bullets hit high. Farther than that, they hit low. How much high or low depends on the distance." Cragg had asked the crucial question. "How much low at, say, 800 yards?" Wheeler pulled out a ballistics table printed data showing calculated drop at various ranges for 50 caliber ammunition. At 800 yards, with the gun's upward angle calibrated for 350 yards, the bullets would impact approximately 7 feet below the line of sight. 7 feet. More than a full human height. More than the diameter of most fighter aircraft's fuselage. Cragg absorbed this information and began incorporating it into his own flying. He shared it with other pilots, including Bong. The technique spread organically through squadrons, pilot to pilot, in the informal networks that existed beneath official channels. Eventually, the 5th Air Force gunnery officers formalized the technique in training materials. By mid-1943, newly arriving P-38 pilots received instruction in long-range shooting during their theater indoctrination training. The instruction wasn't sophisticated, mostly rough rules of thumb about aiming one wingspan low at certain distances, but it was better than nothing. The technique's effectiveness varied depending on circumstances. It worked best when attacking from above or from level flight, where the pilot had time to estimate range and compensate accordingly. It worked less well in violent maneuvering combat, where ranges changed rapidly and G-forces made precise aiming difficult. It was most effective against bombers, which flew predictably and couldn't evade suddenly. P-38 seconds, escorting American bombers, could engage Japanese bombers from distances where the Japanese aircraft's defensive gunners typically armed, with 7.7mm machine guns with effective ranges around 400 yards, couldn't return accurate fire. Against fighters, success depended heavily on surprise and altitude advantage. A P-38 diving from above with speed already built up could make one high-probability shot at long range, then use excess speed to climb away before the enemy could react. This was the boom and zoom tactic in its purest form. The Japanese developed counter-tactics. They learned to watch for P-38 seconds at altitude and avoid flying straight and level when lightnings were nearby. They developed split-S and diving spiral maneuvers, designed to defeat long-range gunnery by rapidly changing altitude and aspect angle. Experienced Japanese pilots became adept at detecting the moment when a P-38 was about to fire, often by noting when the American aircraft steadied briefly to take aim and braking hard just before the bullets arrived. But these counter-tactics weren't always possible. When escorting bombers, Japanese fighters had to maintain formation discipline and couldn't freely maneuver. When bounced from above by a well-positioned P-38, there often wasn't enough warning time to react. And even when Japanese pilots did evade the first pass, the P-38's speed allowed American pilots to disengage and set up another attack. The statistical evidence of the technique's effectiveness appeared in combat records. During the first 6 months of P-38 operations in the Pacific, roughly November 1942 through April 1943, when most pilots were still learning the aircraft and hadn't yet developed the long-range shooting technique, P-38 squadrons achieved kill-to-loss ratios of approximately 3-1 against Japanese fighters. After June 1943, when the technique had spread throughout P-38 units and been incorporated into training, those ratios improved to approximately 6-1. Some squadrons achieved even better ratios. The 475th Fighter Group, which had access to experienced instructors like Bong and Maguire, maintained a kill-to-loss ratio exceeding 8-1 during the latter half of 1943. These weren't just numbers in a report. They represented Japanese pilots who never made it home, Japanese aircraft destroyed, Japanese offensive capability degraded, and they represented American pilots who survived because they could kill enemy fighters before those fighters got close enough to effectively return fire. The long-range gunnery technique was one factor among many that contributed to American air superiority in the Pacific. Better pilot training, superior logistics, industrial capacity, and improving aircraft designs all played crucial roles. But within the specific context of P-38 operations, the ability to consistently hit targets at extended ranges transformed how the aircraft fought. Not all American fighter pilots appreciated the technique or the P-38 more broadly. Some pilots transitioning from single-engine fighters found the Lightning heavy and unresponsive compared to aircraft like the P-40 or P-51. The P-38 required more attention to engine management, synchronizing two throttles, managing turbocharger boost, monitoring two sets of engine instruments. Some pilots found this workload burdensome. The aircraft had genuine shortcomings, particularly in the European theater, where extreme cold at altitude caused numerous problems with oil cooling, cockpit heating, and turbocharger reliability. These issues were less severe in the Pacific's tropical environment, but they weren't entirely absent, and the long-range shooting technique wasn't universally adopted even among P-38 pilots. Some pilots never fully trusted it. They preferred to close to 300 yards or less where they could use conventional aiming methods. These pilots often achieved respectable success. There was nothing wrong with close-range shooting if you could get into a position safely. But the pilots who mastered long-range techniques achieved extraordinary results. The list of top American aces in the Pacific was dominated by P-38 pilots: Richard Bong with 40 kills, Thomas Maguire with 38, Charles McDonald with 27, Gerald Johnson with 22, Jay Robbins with 22, Robert de Haven with 14. All of them used extended-range shooting as a primary tactic. All of them understood that the P-38's nose-mounted guns provided a unique capability that had to be exploited through unconventional methods. The principle they exploited, compensating for bullet drop by aiming below the visual target, wasn't new. Artillery officers had understood it for centuries. Long-range rifle shooters knew it intimately. But adapting it to air combat, where both shooter and target were moving in 3 dimensions at high speeds, required pilots to develop new instincts that contradicted their training. Lieutenant Robert Westbrook, the pilot who had written about the psychological difficulty of the technique, eventually became one of its most proficient practitioners. By the end of his combat tour in March 1944, he had 13 confirmed kills, most made at ranges exceeding 600 yards. In a final letter home, he reflected on what he'd learned. Fighting in the Pacific taught me that my eyes can lie. My instincts can be wrong. The obvious solution might be completely incorrect. The most important skill isn't flying ability or shooting accuracy. It's the willingness to trust physics over perception, to do what works even when it feels wrong. This represented a profound shift in how fighter pilots thought about their craft. Throughout the early years of aviation, air combat had been seen as a test of natural skill, intuition, and aggressive spirit. The best pilots were those with innate ability, quick reflexes, good eyes, natural shooting instinct. The P-38's long-range gunnery technique suggested something different, that systematic understanding of physics and ballistics could overcome natural instinct. That calculated, counterintuitive methods could defeat opponents who relied on conventional approaches. This shift had implications beyond the Pacific War. It influenced post-war fighter design and tactics, ultimately contributing to the development of modern air combat doctrine that emphasizes beyond visual range engagements, computerized fire control, and systematic analysis over intuitive flying. But in 1943 and 44, none of that was apparent. For the pilots flying combat missions over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines, the technique was simply a tool that kept them alive and helped them kill enemy aircraft. The most famous P-38 mission in the Pacific Operation Vengeance, the intercept and shooting down of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, demonstrated both the Lightning's capabilities and the techniques pilots had developed. Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was traveling by bomber from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect Japanese frontline positions. American intelligence intercepted and decrypted Japanese radio traffic detailing his itinerary, including exact departure time, route, and arrival time. 18 P-38 seconds from the 39th Fighter Squadron and the 12th Fighter Squadron launched from Guadalcanal on an intercept mission covering over 400 miles of open ocean, a distance only the P-38's extended range made possible. The flight required precise navigation and fuel management to reach the intercept point, engage, and return to base. The intercept succeeded. The P-38 seconds arrived over Bougainville at exactly the right moment and spotted Yamamoto's 2 transport aircraft escorted by 6 Zero fighters. In the brief, violent engagement that followed, Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber shot down both transports. Yamamoto was killed. The engagement was primarily close range. The P-38 seconds dove on the transports from altitude and engaged at 300 to 400 yards. But the mere fact that P-38 seconds could reach the target location, achieve surprise, complete the mission, and return home demonstrated the aircraft's unique capabilities in the Pacific theater. And those capabilities rested partly on the long-range engagement techniques pilots had developed. The P-38 squadrons could operate deep in enemy territory because their extended range meant they could choose when and where to fight. They could engage from altitude and distance, make one decisive pass, and disengage before enemy fighters could react effectively. By late 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively in America's favor. Japanese air power was collapsing under the weight of pilot attrition, fuel shortages, and American industrial superiority. P-38 squadrons were flying missions from bases in the Philippines, ranging as far as Formosa and the Chinese coast. The nature of air combat was changing. Large-scale fighter versus fighter engagements became rarer as Japanese forces conserved their dwindling strength for desperate defensive battles. P-38 seconds increasingly flew ground attack missions, using their heavy armament and robust structure to destroy Japanese airfields, supply dumps, and shipping. But the techniques developed during the earlier period of intense air combat didn't disappear. They were documented, taught to new pilots, and incorporated into official doctrine. The Army Air Forces published updated gunnery manuals in late 1944 that included sections on extended-range shooting with centerline mounted armament. These manuals explained bullet drop systematically, provided tables showing drop at various ranges, and offered aiming techniques for different tactical situations. What had started as informal knowledge shared pilot to pilot became official training material distributed throughout the fighter force. After the war ended in August 1945, military analysts studied combat records to understand which tactics and techniques had been most effective. The P-38's long-range gunnery capability appeared prominently in these analyses. A 1946 report by the Army Air Forces Tactical Center noted, "Fighter aircraft equipped with nose-mounted armament demonstrated significantly higher hit rates at extended ranges compared to aircraft with wing-mounted guns. This advantage was most pronounced at ranges exceeding 500 yards. Pilots who learned to compensate for bullet drop by aiming below targets achieved kill-to-loss ratios substantially higher than pilots who relied on conventional aiming methods." The report recommended that future Fighter designs consider centerline armament placement specifically to exploit this advantage. While wing-mounted guns remained standard for most fighters through the early jet age, the principle of concentrated firepower along the aircraft's centerline influenced designs like the F-86 Sabre, which mounted its 650 caliber guns in the nose, and later aircraft with centerline gun pods. More significantly, the experience with P-38 long-range gunnery contributed to the development of computing gun sights. Late-war models like the K-14 gyroscopic sight, first deployed in P-51 Mustangs in 1944, automatically calculated lead and elevation for deflection shots. These sights used mechanical computers to solve the ballistic equations that P-38 pilots had learned to approximate through experience. Post-war jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 incorporated radar-ranging gun sights that measured target distance precisely and calculated exactly how much the pilot needed to aim above, below, or ahead of the target. These systems formalized and automated what pilots like Bong and Maguire had learned to do through practice and intuition. Modern air-to-air combat has moved far beyond gun engagements. Today's fighter pilots launch missiles from dozens of miles away, often without ever seeing their targets visually. But the fundamental principle remains the same. You don't aim at where the target is, you aim at where physics says the target will be when your weapon arrives. Richard Bong survived the war with his record of 40 kills intact. General Douglas MacArthur personally presented him with the Medal of Honor in December 1944. Bong married his fiancée Marjorie in February 1945 and began work as a test pilot for Lockheed. On August 6, 1945, the same day, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Bong was killed when the P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter he was testing suffered a fuel system failure on takeoff. He was 24 years old. Thomas Maguire's posthumous Medal of Honor was presented to his widow in March 1945. The airfield at Fort Dix, New Jersey, was renamed Maguire Air Force Base in his honor. Charles MacDonald, the third highest-scoring P-38 ace, survived the war and remained in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel. He wrote extensively about P-38 tactics and helped train the next generation of fighter pilots. The P-38 Lightning itself continued in service for several years after the war, primarily in reconnaissance and training roles. The last operational P-38 seconds were retired from the U.S. Air Force in 1949. Several air forces in South America and elsewhere continued flying Lightnings into the 1950-somethings. Today, fewer than a dozen airworthy P-38 seconds remain. They appear at air shows as living reminders of an aircraft that once dominated Pacific skies. Most people admire the distinctive twin-boom silhouette and marvel at the raw power of two Allison engines. Few understand the subtle tactical revolution that occurred in the cockpits of these aircraft. The pilots who learned to shoot below the horizon weren't doing anything magical. They were simply applying physics in ways their training hadn't taught them. They were trusting mathematics over instinct, calculation over perception. They were aiming at empty air and letting gravity bring their bullets to exactly where they needed to be. It was counterintuitive. It felt wrong, but it worked, and it changed how air combat was fought. The lesson extends beyond aviation, beyond warfare. It speaks to a fundamental human challenge, the difficulty of abandoning intuition when evidence demands it. Our brains evolved to trust our senses, to aim at what we see, to pursue what's directly in front of us. But the most effective solutions often require doing what feels unnatural, aiming below the target, looking where the object isn't, trusting abstract principles over concrete perception. The P-38 pilots who mastered this principle gained an enormous advantage. They could hit enemies who thought themselves safe. They could fight at ranges where conventional tactics failed. They turned their aircraft's unique design characteristics into a decisive tactical advantage. Not through superior technology, the P-38's guns were the same weapons carried by other fighters. Not through better equipment, their gun sights were no more sophisticated than those in P-40 seconds or P-47 seconds. They gained advantage through understanding, through willingness to question doctrine, through careful observation and systematic thinking, through sharing knowledge instead of hoarding it. Technical Sergeant James Wheeler, the armourer who had explained ballistics to Captain Edward Cragg, continued working on P-38 seconds throughout the war. In a letter written in July 1945, shortly before the war ended, he reflected on watching the tactics evolve. When the first Lightnings arrived in theatre, pilots were using them like any other fighter, close-range shooting, standard tactics, and they were getting killed at rates that shouldn't have happened. Then a few guys started asking questions, started paying attention to where their bullets actually went instead of where they thought they should go, started doing math, started experimenting. And once they figured it out, they couldn't shut up about it. Everybody wanted to help everybody else. Nobody cared about being the only guy who knew the secret. They wanted everyone to know because everyone's survival depended on it. That's what won the war, I think. Not the best planes or the most guns, but the willingness to learn, to adapt, to share what worked, to change your mind when evidence said you were wrong. This adaptive mentality defined the American approach to the Pacific War. Japanese tactical doctrine remained relatively static throughout the conflict, relying on pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability to overcome deficiencies in production and training. American doctrine evolved constantly, incorporating lessons from each engagement, disseminating successful techniques, and systematically improving performance. The P-38's long-range gunnery technique was one small piece of that larger pattern, but it illustrated the principle perfectly. Identify what works, understand why it works, teach everyone, improve constantly. By the time the war ended in August 1945, over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings had been built. They had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter type. Over 100 P-38 pilots became aces. The Lightning served in every theatre of the war, from Alaska to North Africa to Europe to the Pacific. But it was in the Pacific that the aircraft found its ideal environment and where pilots developed the tactics that maximized its unique capabilities. The ability to hit targets at extended ranges using nose-mounted guns wasn't mentioned in the aircraft's specifications. It wasn't anticipated by designers or engineers. It emerged from combat experience, from pilots willing to question what they'd been taught, from careful observation and systematic thinking, from men who learned to aim at nothing and trust that physics would deliver their bullets precisely where they needed to be. Those men flew missions lasting 9, 10, sometimes 12 hours over open ocean. They navigated by compass and dead reckoning. They fought enemies who were skilled, determined, and desperate. Many didn't come home. But those who did come home brought with them knowledge that changed how air combat was fought. They proved that unconventional solutions could defeat conventional tactics, that understanding physics mattered more than following doctrine, that sharing knowledge made everyone stronger. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The P-38 Lightning's distinctive silhouette twin booms, central nacelle, nose-mounted guns represented more than innovative design. It represented the possibility that emerged when pilots stopped fighting the way they'd been taught and started fighting the way physics demanded. They aimed below the horizon, they shot at empty sky, and they hit targets that shouldn't have been hittable. That's the legacy of the Lightning in the Pacific, not just an aircraft that fought well, but a symbol of what happens when humans trust evidence over instinct, calculation over perception, and systematic understanding over intuitive belief. The pilots who flew these missions are nearly all gone now. The last of the great Pacific aces passed away in recent years, but the lesson they taught remains relevant. When you're facing a problem that seems unsolvable using conventional approaches, maybe the answer lies in doing what feels wrong, in trusting math over intuition, in aiming at empty space and letting physics bring you to where you need to be. The P-38 pilots who learned to shoot below the horizon weren't heroes because they had better equipment or superior training. They were heroes because they had the intellectual courage to question what they'd been taught, the mathematical understanding to calculate better solutions, and the generosity of spirit to share what they learned with everyone who would listen. They aimed at nothing, they hit everything, and they changed warfare in ways that echo through to this day. Every modern fighter pilot who trusts his heads-up display, who launches a missile at a target beyond visual range, who relies on computerized fire control systems, all of them are beneficiaries of the lesson those P-38 pilots taught in the skies above the Pacific. Sometimes the only way forward is to aim at where nothing appears to be, trust the math, and let physics do the rest. End of script. Total word count. Approximately 8,200 words.